I'm Rafi Siegel. I teach urban design and planning here at the GSD. I will introduce the next session on Africa. And both are wonderful speakers. We approach Africa from its two edges, as you will see, Cairo and Johannesburg. Both of these places in Africa, but also probably outside of it in many ways. And beyond kind of their unique condition, perhaps they can teach us also something about a possible future role in this kind of fast-growing continent in terms of urbanization. And probably more interesting, the youngest kind of continent in the world. Over 44% of the population of Africa is 15 years or younger, so it's really amazing. Our first speaker, Nasser Rabat, which I had the pleasure to hear several times. We'll talk about Cairo, and we'll actually get right to the heart of it and talk about Tahrir Square. Nasser is the Aga Khan Professor of Islamic Architecture at MIT, where he has been teaching since 1991. His interests include Islamic art and architecture, medieval urban history and historiography, and post-colonial criticism. His research focuses on the overlapping intercultural spaces where people have always met and engaged ideas, views, beliefs, and practices, and in the process created art and architecture. So a wonderful kind of example through his presentation. Nasser Rabat's books include The Citadel of Cairo, a new interpretation of Royal Mamluk architecture, Mamluk history through architecture, and The Courtyard House between cultural reference and universal relevance. Following Nasser, Lindsay Bremner from Johannesburg will talk about, well, not anymore from Johannesburg, but still connected in a way. We'll talk about Johannesburg and its kind of complexities and unique conditions. Very much looking forward to that. Lindsay is a former chair of architecture at Temple University and of the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Witwatersrand. Is that right? Wow. Johannesburg. Lindsay Bremner has written and published widely on architecture and urbanism. Her recent books include Johannesburg, One City, Colliding World, Johannesburg's The Elusive Metropolis, and Writing the City into Being, Essays on Johannesburg, 1998 to 2008. Her current project, Folded Ocean, is investigating the organizational, spatial, and architectural logic of the Indian Ocean world. And this is also something to look forward to. But first with Nasser, please.
As most of you probably noticed by now, this presentation is perhaps actually a result of a misunderstanding on my part. I have no idea what this conference is about. So when Mohsen said, would you speak about Cairo, I didn't know whether he wanted me to speak about Cairo or about something that I'm interested in the current moment. I am a medieval historian, so actually dealing with the present is very much sort of like me stepping out of my comfort zone. But the events in Egypt have fired me up like many other people. And I decided that I'll take a chance on sort of perhaps actually looking at the history of the center of action in Egypt. So it is really not a history of Cairo, not even, as a matter of fact, an attempt at trying to understand the development of such a complex city. It is an attempt to perhaps actually trying to understand the development of such a complex square, I should say. So take it as such. I would be more than willing to respond to any question about the history of Cairo, a topic about which I'm actually teaching a course currently at MIT. We are now around 1170 in the development of the city. So we will be moving down to the present. When I first went to Cairo as a graduate student in 1985 to do research on precisely that, the 1170 period, which resulted in my dissertation on the Citadel of Cairo, I had to confront Tahrir Square like everyone else had. I mean, it is the center of life in Cairo, especially for people who are not from Egypt. It is the place from which most important events in the life of visitors and residents will take place. For those of us who come from the US, it is the place where you went until the very unfortunate decision of the American University in Cairo to move its campus from downtown Cairo to the new neighborhood of New Cairo, an upper-end new development about 35 kilometers away from central Cairo. So it's actually no longer really a center of education and of intellectual exchange because it's so far away. But also, Tahrir Square was the place where you had to cross in order to go into different places. Over the 27 years since my first visit, I've been back to Cairo about 100 times, and Tahrir Square has changed practically almost every visit. This is really one fast changing space in the city. I'm not going to look at it in any details in the last 27 years. I'm going to give you basically a little bit more of a longue durée type of history for the city. But I just wanted to tell you that it is constantly changing. And listening to Arjun's yesterday, I actually thought that it is decidedly what Arjun was describing yesterday. It's a history of what's being built, but also what's being erased that I'm going to be presenting to you. 27 years down the line, I started thinking, perhaps what we are looking at is a palimpsest, a word that 27 years ago I did not know. I had no idea what it meant. So throughout its modern history, Egypt has rarely spoken for itself. Khedives, sultans, kings, colonial proconsuls, colonels, and generals have taken turns in ruling it autocratically, and rarely have its people been able to decide on who should govern them and how. This began with a cruel colonial farce when Napoleon Bonaparte landed with his army in Alexandria in July 1798 to occupy Egypt and cunningly promised the Egyptians liberation from their oppressors. It took more than his vacuous declaration for a more genuine call for freedom to resound across the country, with the uprising of Ahmed Urabi and the Egyptian army in 1879, and less than 3 years for it to be dashed by the British occupation of 1882. A massive uprising against the British in 1919 galvanized the people around Saad Zaghloul, nicknamed the father of the Egyptians, and his Wafd party, which was pressing the British for independence. But that popular movement that brought all Egyptians together for one cause was a fleeting moment. The incomplete independence and festering problems with the British, in addition to the failure of 7 Arab armies to stand up to the Zionists' expansion in Palestine in 1948, were among the primary causes behind the Free Officers' Revolution in 1952. Promising a lot and delivering little, the revolution reneged on its pledge of granting political freedom to all, and Egypt entered a protracted age of military dictatorship, from whose rotten grip it is now struggling to emerge. On the 25th of January, the youth of the so-called Facebook generation took to the streets to peacefully reclaim their freedom. They were joined by the much less affluent youth of the squatters, and ultimately by representatives of all classes, professions, and age groups. They stood in Tahrir Square in Cairo and other squares in every city, hoisting their banners and chanting their slogans, demanding the departure of Mubarak and his regime. The square virtually became their home, their operation room, and our window on their revolution. It morphed into the place where they live, sleep, pray, socialize, demonstrate, and shape their destiny. Many lost their lives defending it and their burgeoning revolution therein, against the attacks of the so-called Mubarak supporters. Others found meaning to their life in finally breaking the chain of fear and revolting against the regime that has dehumanized them for so long. Still others seized the occasion and inscribed their own fate onto that of their country, as when Ahmed Za'fan and Ula Abdul Hamid held their wedding in the square on the 6th of February with thousands of protesters as witnesses to their love and commitment to each other. In fact, Tahrir Square has come to frame the youth revolution and to represent its exuberance and anguish at the same time. To a world that watched with wonderment, it has acquired the same mystique that other squares of revolution had gained before. The Place de la Bastille in Paris, the Red Square in Moscow, the Azadi Square in Tehran, and most famously for our short-memoried present, Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Unlike them, however, Tahrir Square was not planned as a central square in the city. It grew out of the accumulation of leftover spaces that coalesced over time to form its huge trapezoidal contours. An urban planning failure of sorts, Tahrir Square holds in its unwieldy open space and its hodgepodge of built edges the key to an understanding of the modern history of Cairo and, by extension, of Egypt. That was the intention of neither the square's first planner nor its successive rebuilders. The square started life as Qasr al-Nil Square, an open space left between a series of royal palaces along the eastern bank of the Nile and the new district designed à la Française in the late 1860s by Ismail Pasha, the impatient modernizer who wanted to turn Egypt into a piece of Europe. That's his word, despite all adverse circumstances. His passion for Europeanization was exemplified by this grand urban project, which extended from the medieval city westward toward the Nile along a north-south axis, with avenues lined with trees radiating from central squares to form star patterns modeled after the imperial Paris of Baron Haussmann. Planned in haste by a Haussmannian designer, Pierre Grand, the new city was meant to impress Ismail's guests, the European monarchs, who had been invited to Egypt for the inauguration of the Suez Canal in 1869. But having borrowed heavily from rapacious European banks to bankroll his flamboyant projects, Ismail ended by bankrupting the country and was deposed in 1879 before the completion of his Parisian-style posh residential district of Al-Ismailiyya, named after himself. 3 years later, the British occupied Egypt, ostensibly to strengthen the country's finances and to secure the repayment of its heavy debts, but ended up staying for 72 years. One of the first British colonial acts, and that's my gesture towards Lindsay and my presentation connected together. That's our claim on Africa. You can see it in here. So one of the first British colonial acts was the requisition of the main palace. How do I turn this on? Oh, here. And that's the main palace that I'm talking about. It's actually really on the edge in here, which gave the square its first name, the Qasr al-Nil Square. Here you have it in the plan. To become the headquarters of their occupation army, British soldiers used the court between the barracks and the square to the east as a daily parade ground. Egyptians demonstrated against the British in front of the palace barracks. Clashes ensued, and the square saw its first martyrs for freedom around the turn of the 20th century, with a peak during the revolution of 1919, when many demonstrations against the British occupation converged on Ismailiyya Square. At the turn of the century, the square area acquired its first major cultural institution, the Egyptian Museum, completed in 1902 north of the British barracks Qasr al-Nil Palace to house the unique Egyptian collection of pharaonic antiquities. A neoclassical structure dreamt by a French Egyptologist, Mariette Pasha, designed by a French architect, Dourgnon, and built by an Italian construction company, Garroso and Zaffarani, the museum was in fact an institution planted in Egypt for practical reasons, but celebrating a heritage that Europeans have already appropriated as their own. For a long time, the building was the domain of Western Egyptologists and historians, the first place to visit for Western tourists, and the memorial to the late 19th century generation of explorers Egyptologists. Despite changes in recent decades that Egyptianized the staff and opened the exhibits to all classes of people, neither the museum nor the heritage it shelters are fully integrated in the cultural consciousness of the city or the country. The beginning of the 20th century was also a time of colonially driven economic growth and further modernization. Many of the large palaces and fancy villas around Ismailia Square that embodied the wealth of a land-owning aristocratic class lost their raison d'etre with the emergence of a new wealthy class, the foreign mercantile entrepreneurs. They bought these palaces with huge gardens and parceled them out into smart Art Deco apartment buildings. All of these buildings in here have either Greek or Italian or French names after their owners, many of which still stands today on the northeastern corner of the square. Of the three palaces that remain today, two played important roles in the modern political and cultural history of Egypt, whereas the third, the palace of Prince Said Halim, which had a shot at becoming a known address, a known world address, by the way, before the remapping of the world after World War I, is truncated, deserted, and ruined today. Said Halim became the prime minister of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, and there was a chance of sort of like regaining Egypt back through him and through his claim to the crown of Egypt. The first palace that still stands today is the neo-Baroque palace of Kamal ad-Din, which was until recently, 3 years ago, the seat of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Built by the prolific Slovenian architect Anton Lasiak between 1906 and 1913 for Prince Kamal ad-Din Hussein, the tragic son of the one and only sultan in the modern history of Egypt, the palace's dainty white facades cut a beautiful profile at the western tip of the square. The second palace is that of Ahmed Khairi Pasha, built in 1874 for this minister of Ismail's in a neo-Mamluk style. It successively housed a Greek cigarette factory, the Egyptian University, which is called today Cairo University, for 10 years between 1909 and 1920, and the American University in Cairo, AUC, between 1920 and 2008. Established there as an American-style school, AUC campus had become both a symbol of American culture, derided and admired at the same time, and one of Egypt's finest institutions of higher education until AUC's relocation to New Cairo at 35 kilometers away. The one building that came to be associated in the minds of all with the eternal and gargantuan Egyptian bureaucracy is the behemoth al-Mugamma, literally the collective, situated on the southwestern end of the square to house most government agencies. Ironically, al-Mugamma is a gift from the Soviet Union to the Kingdom of Egypt. The Mugamma was not inaugurated, though, until after the revolution of 1952 and Egypt turned into a republic, and thus it became a symbol of all that is statist, authoritarian, and ineffective in Abdel Nasser's republic. The building, designed by an Egyptian architect, Kemal Ismail, recalls Soviet-style compound, but its facade display unmistakable references to the facade of the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, built between 1356 and 1361, the most monumental Mamluk structure in Cairo. No Egyptian or visitor can escape the Mugamma. Birth certificates, passports, driver's license, residency visas, and many other official papers can only be obtained there. People burn their nerves through interminable hours of pushing papers from one office to the other in its interminable corridors and trying to satisfy the whims of apathetic civil servants. No wonder that the building appeared in many movies and became the butt of joke for all that is wrong with the Egyptian government. This is, by the way, a very famous movie of the late 1990s, and it's called Terrorism and Kebab. In Arabic, it rhymes. It's called Irhab wa Kebab. Trying to erase all traces of the long ruling royal family, Abdel Nasser changed the names of many streets and squares in Cairo after the revolution of 1952. Ismailia Square became Hurriya, Freedom Square, in August of 1952, and was then rechristened as Tahrir, liberation. You can see in Arabic, Hurriya and Tahrir, they come from the same root. So Freedom and Liberation Square in September of 1954, in reference to the success of the free officers in negotiating a termination to the presence of the British in Egypt, hence the liberation of the country from the last vestiges of colonial occupation. Abdel Nasser also added two major buildings to Tahrir Square on the site of what used to be the British barracks of Qasr al-Nil that capture the impulses of a new regime searching for its bearings. The first was the flamboyant Hilton Hotel, built by Wilton Beckett in 1959, right to the southwest of the Egyptian Museum and overlooking the Nile. This swanky five-star hotel eagerly projected all that America wanted to represent at the beginning of the Cold War: modernity, luxury, efficiency, and comfort. The hotel succeeded spectacularly and became the premier hotel in Cairo. But the propaganda failed, and Nasser's Egypt continued to move away from the West in a direction of non-alignment and ultimately strategic friendship with the Soviet Union. The second building was the drab yet functional modernist headquarters of the Arab League, completed in 1958 by the Egyptian architect Mahmoud Riyad on a site south of the Nile Hilton. The building marks the moment in which Abdel Nasser was riding high on the wave of pan-Arabism that was sweeping across the Arab world and that resulted in the toppling of several regimes and the establishment of the short-lived United Arab Republic between Egypt and Syria, and me getting my name as a consequence, by the way, my first name. Although the building is today squeezed between two symbols of American economic and cultural dominance, the Intercontinental and what used to be the Nile Hilton, and now it's the Ritz Carlton. And although the Arab League mostly failed in its missions, there is no denying the clear rekindling of Arab solidarity expressed by the youth of the 25th of January revolution and by their supporters across the Arab world. Before the 1952 revolution, Ismailia Square had a granite round pedestal waiting for its statue. The intention of King Farouk was to have a statue of his grandfather, Ismail Pasha, there, which of course would have been a late recognition of Ismail's legacy. But the situation changed after the revolution of 1952. Abdel Nasser and his admirers wanted his statue erected there instead. But the tragic defeat in the Six-Day War with Israel in 1967 drastically diminished the likelihood of such an honor in Cairo's symbolic center. The pedestal stayed empty until it was removed altogether with the excavation of the square in the 1980s in preparation for the construction of a new Cairo metro. Tahrir Square was officially renamed Sadat Square, and this is actually a vestige of that, after his assassination in 1981. And it is possible that some cronies of the dead president may have contemplated having his statue installed there as well. But the new name faded away very fast. The title Sadat migrated to the first metro station under Tahrir Square, and the square kept its revolutionary designation. The sole religious building in Tahrir Square is a relative latecomer. The elegant mosque of Omar Makram was built north of the Mugamma at the end of the royal era by the Italian architect Mario Rossi, who became the chief architect of the Waqf ministry for about 30 years and converted to Islam at the end of his life and is buried in Cairo, in a neo-Mamluk style, all his own. The mosque fast became the funerary mosque of choice for the Cairene elite. Not a day passes without one or two memorial services for a politician, a higher officer, an artist, or a member of the intelligentsia held there. In 2003, the open space in front of the mosque acquired the one and only statue in Tahrir Square, a statue of Omar Makram himself, as part of a move to create foci of remembrance in the city in the form of statues of the nation's hero. There were about 10 of them spread in the city that year. Omar Makram was indeed a hero, an Azhar-educated sheikh and a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, which for Muslims is a big deal. He led the uprising against the French in 1800, then provided Muhammad Ali with the popular support he needed in his struggle against Istanbul and the Mamluks, but turned against Muhammad Ali when the latter showed his real autocratic intentions and ended by being exiled to Damietta and then Tanta, north of Cairo, where he died. The slogans painted on the statue's pedestal and on canvases hanging from its body, shown in a picture, or in many pictures actually circulating these days, show that the revolutionary youth of 2011 may be looking up to their forerunner in the struggle on the road to freedom. Surrounded by architectural reminders of all the forces that want to lay claim to their identity and guarantee their loyalty, a fantastic ancient heritage and a graceful recent one, a powerful yet labyrinthine government, a dream of regional unity, multiple markers of religion, education, and resistance, and unaffordable temptations of luxurious American-style consumerism, the Egyptian youth shaped their destiny on the 25th of January. Their revolution vindicated the sacrifices of all the protests that ignited there before their protest, and finally validated the designation of the square as Tahrir Square, 57 years after a bunch of rebellious officers gave it the name but failed to deliver on their promise of liberation. Thank you.